Continuing on with Chapter 5, this is page 117, and we're going to start with biogeochemical cycles here. So biogeochemical cycles are very important on the AP test. Make sure you know all of the vocab on this page. It talks about nutrient cycling and biogeochemical cycles and what a pool is. Another name for a pool is a reservoir. Know what residence time means. Flux is a traveling time between different reservoirs of a certain kind of nutrient. A source and a sink. We'll be referring to those vocab terms frequently, not just in this chapter, but also for the rest of the year. All right, so we're going to turn to page 120. On page 120, we have a picture of the water cycle, and the water cycle is somewhat easy. Let me go ahead and fix my page. There we go. You've been studying the water cycle for a lot of years, so it shouldn't be anything too challenging for you. So over here I have a sticky note on page 121 that says know all the vocab for the water cycle. And where is the vocab? Well, let me go back over here to 120, and you can see here we have the water cycle is also known as the hydraulic cycle. So the AP test might call it either one, it just sort of depends. We have evaporation, transpiration. Those are two words you need to know. Precipitation, the AP test will not use the word rain, but it will use the word precipitation. You need to know what groundwater, aquifers, and the water table are. You also need to know the human impacts for the water cycle, which includes building dams and aqueducts. Irrigation alters the water cycle, and overpumping groundwater alters the water cycle as well. So make sure that you know the human impacts. All right, on the carbon cycle, what you need to know for the carbon cycle is that the largest reservoir of the carbon is sedimentary rock, and the second largest is oceans. And let's talk about the oceans really quickly. The oceans are taking in carbon in a couple of different ways. They dissolve CO2 from the atmosphere to the water, and the oceans also can absorb carbon through the shells of animals. There are certain kinds of plankton and also shells like coral shells that take in calcium carbonate, that are made out of calcium carbonate, and so they take in the carbon to make calcium carbonate in their shells. Also, through photosynthesis of plankton, we can take in carbon and turn it into dissolved oxygen within the ocean. So those are some of the ways that the ocean is influenced by the carbon cycle. Turning the page. So a lot of these cycles I've redrawn because I think it's a little bit easier. My drawings look complicated, but they're actually easier than the ones in the book. So up here we have the carbon cycle, and if you just take a minute to pause the video and to draw it, might be a great idea. But first we'll start up here with producers. So we have our basic producer-consumer loop that you've studied in biology class. Basically, your producers, and this includes plants, but it also can include plankton in the ocean and algae. Basically, they give us oxygen through photosynthesis, and we as animals are consumers. Bacteria are also consumers, so it's not just animals. We give producers carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. And one little side note here, it's not a direct loop. Producers take in carbon dioxide and actually make tissues for their bodies. So trees will take it in and make tree tissue. The oxygen from photosynthesis does not come directly from the CO2. The oxygen actually comes from water. So this does not turn into that in photosynthesis. That's a common misperception. the processes give us this gas and then this gas, but really CO2 turns into plant tissues and makes plants bigger, or plankton bigger, or other producers. All right, when producers die or consumers die, the decomposition adds carbon into the ground. When you burn, mainly producers, I mean consumers can also be burned, but really it's your producers that are burned more often. The most common thing to be burned would be trees, and for fireplaces. Sometimes in some places they burn trees for creating electricity, but that's not as common. Also, people, not just their fireplaces, but they cook in a lot of the world. In your poorer countries, in your developing countries, they'll burn trees for cooking. In the United States, we turn corn into ethanol and we burn that in automobiles. So that would also be considered part of the carbon cycle. All right, so carbon in the ground, or even carbon that we cut down or grow and burn, all adds carbon to the atmosphere. So carbon in the ground over millions of years can turn into fossil fuels. Then we burn them and we put carbon in the atmosphere. So that's a basic carbon cycle that is probably a little bit more clear than your book. Hopefully, that's why I drew it. The AP test always wants you to know how humans alter all of these cycles. So humans alter the carbon cycle. We mine and we burn fossil fuels. We cut down forests. We burn those forests and other biomass like ethanol or even paper. Sometimes we burn trash, which has a lot of paper in it. All of this adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which causes global warming. Okay, moving on to the nitrogen cycle, which is the most complicated of the cycles to learn. So, nitrogen cycle. So you can see up here we have a very complicated picture, and we have places where we have nitrogen sinks and pools, and then flux is where the arrows are. We call that flux. So here we go. This looks complicated, but draw it out and it might make sense as you draw it out. So pause the video and draw it out. But basically, let's start here with nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen in the atmosphere is a gas that is unusable to plants. So it must be transformed into a usable form. And that usable form can either be NH4, which is ammonia, or NO3, which is nitrates. So lightning strikes or nitrogen-fixing bacteria can turn nitrogen gas into ammonia. It also can turn it into nitrates. And it does it through the roots of legumes. So I have these little nodules here drawn on this legume. A legume could be a bean plant or a soy, or even peanuts are legumes. And on their roots are nodules that can turn into gas into NH4. It's bacteria that live in the nodules that do this. They're called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Well, this nitrogen can also be used by other plants. And then nitrogen is an essential nutrient for producers to grow. Phytoplankton, algae, plants all need nitrogen. Without it, they won't grow. All right, so how do we in our bodies get nitrogen? Because we need nitrogen in our bodies for things like DNA, for ATP, DNA that is made out of nucleotides, and nitrogen's a big part of that. So we need nitrogen in our body, so we eat plants, also other animals, to get the nitrogen in our body. And so when we eat a plant, it's called assimilation. Also, when a plant uptakes nitrates or ammonia through the roots, it's also called assimilation. So the process of getting nitrogen into your body is called assimilation. All right, so then we have poop, which we call waste, and also dead things. So when things die, and I just put this generic dead things here, but this could be dead plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, whatever it is, but dead things and waste. are full of ammonia. And we call this process ammonification. So dying and decomposing and waste is ammonification. Ammonia is pretty toxic to especially aquatic animals. You have to get that ammonia out of there. And so the process of nitrification will take ammonia and turn it first into nitrites and then into nitrates. And it does this through nitrifying bacteria. And then nitrates are a form that plants use again. So plants really love dead things and poop because they can then use these nitrates again to grow. And it's a form of natural fertilizer. All right, nitrates can also be turned back into N2 gas through the process of denitrification. You have to know everything on here and how it works. So it's a process of straight memorization. You might just want to draw it out a few times. But let's go ahead also and write the terms. So turn 2 pages over to page 125, and we're going to go ahead and write our terms on page 125. Okay, so first we have nitrogen fixation up here. So again, we're taking N2 gas and we're turning it into ammonia, NH3. And we can do this through 2 ways. One is through lightning strikes, but the more common way is through nitrogen fixing bacteria on the roots of legumes. And there's a picture of these roots here. You can see there's a picture of root nodules that have nitrogen fixing bacteria on them on, again, legumes. Bean plants, soy, peanuts, all are legumes. Okay, the next term is nitrification. And this is when you have nitrifying bacteria that turn ammonia first into nitrites, then into nitrates. And plants really like nitrates. It's the most usable form of nitrogen that they can use, and so it's pretty essential for them to have nitrates. And then denitrification is where we take nitrates back into N2 gas, and that's bacteria that do that again. Bacteria kind of do all parts of the nitrogen cycle. I'm going to flip up here to ammonification. Decomposition and animal waste have ammonia, which is a toxic to aquatic life, and then the formula is covered up here, so let me move it, is NH3. And then the next vocab term is assimilation. That's when animals eat nitrates through plants or animals, or plants take it in through their roots. All right, humans alter the nitrogen cycle. The AP test always wants you to know, how do humans alter the nitrogen cycle? So we have this artificial process called Haber-Bosch, and it was invented in the 1930s and 40s, and they first used this process to make nitrogen bombs for World War II. But then after World War II, we had this excess of nitrogen, and people thought, hey, let's use it for fertilizer. So now we use this same process to actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a usable form, nitrates or ammonia. And so this has dramatically increased the amount of nitrogen available for humans to use, and we put it in fertilizer, but it doesn't just stay in fertilizer, it also runs down into streams and rivers and causes all kinds of problems. We also burn fossil fuels, and fossil fuels contain nitrogen in them, and it releases something called NO2 in the atmosphere, which is an air pollutant. One thing we also do is we plant a lot of legumes, and so that will alter it. I mean, you're like, well, why is that bad to create more? Some of these alterings are not necessarily good or bad, they just are an altering by humans. So when we plant a lot of soy, that's a lot of nitrogen fixation. We're adding a lot of nitrogen to the soil. And then also we create acid rain. HNO3 is nitric acid, and we'll study a lot more about acid rain in chapter 17 extensively.